this had never happened, and wondered why he had to make this decision. After some thought, the commander stated that it would be better to set up the next outpost in Daphanon, and Matthias asked if he was sure of his decision. The commander confirmed his words and explained that there were mountains in the back of Rhine so they could be besieged, and Daphanon was located on a hill, so the Empire's army would have an advantage if they made this point an outpost. This explanation suited Matthias, so he gave the order to declare Daphanon the next outpost. The commander walked out of the tent, holding his broken arm, thinking that Matthias had been absolutely useless in this war, and very much regretting that Carlyle was not in command. News arrived to Carlyle that there was war going on, and that Daphanon had only held out for 5 days after Aphatos, which pleased Carlyle greatly, and he wondered if Matthias had fled the battlefield yet. Clutching the letter from the Emperor, Carlyle noted with displeasure that Kendrick did not care much about this war, since he dared to order Carlyle to fight in the south after he himself had exiled Carlyle to the north. Having calmed down, Carlyle ordered the messenger to tell Kendrick that Carlyle politely declined such an offer, as he was very busy defending Pervaz. The envoy, realizing that he would not receive anything good from the Emperor for such an answer from Carlyle, tried to convince Carlyle that if he refused, the Southern Alliance would invade the capital, to which Carlyle asked why the aristocrats did not join forces with the capital's guards to prevent this from happening. The envoy sighed and explained that most of the aristocrats from the central region did not support the Empire with military aid, which made Carlyle smile, since the situation was developing very favorably for him. With a smile, Carlyle stated that he could help, but if he succeeded in suppressing the South, he would demand that his status as Crown Prince be returned to him, and he would not agree to any other conditions. This answer also frightened the envoy, because they simply did not have time to wait for Kendrick's answer to Carlyle's demand, so he suggested that Carlyle go with him to the capital to receive the Emperor's answer directly. Carlyle slapped his palm on the table and rose in irritation, declaring that he would wait for Kendrick's answer in Pervaz and advised the envoy to hurry, since, as he himself said, there was very little time. At this point, Carlyle chose to end the conversation and headed towards the exit of the hall, leaving the envoy in gloomy thoughts about how all this could be arranged. Already looking at Carlyle's back, the messenger replied that he understood everything and bowed, although he understood that Carlyle would not see it. The messenger said that he would return to the capital and convey everything to Kendrick, which made Carlyle smile, because in the end, everything went exactly as he planned. After some time, Carlyle decided to hold a council, to which he invited Asha, among others. Entering Carlyle's office, Asha saw Carlyle and Lionel, who were carefully studying some documents. Carlyle was glad to see Asha, and said that it seemed like they had a sudden matter that needed to be resolved, which did not please Asha at all, because it sounded like more trouble. Carlyle, not giving the girl time to come to her senses, stunned her with the news that the Southern Alliance had begun a rebellion. With his arms crossed in front of him, Carlyle stated that Kendrick had demanded his participation in this war, but Carlyle had only agreed on the condition that he be given back his title of Crown Prince. Asha thought that in this case, the divorce would happen earlier than the planned 3 years, clenched her fists to keep her emotions in check, and asked if she needed to file for divorce now. Carlyle was surprised by such a question. He asked why he was filing for divorce, and whether he had done anything that offended Asha, to which the girl asked in surprise why she had been called then, if not for this reason. Carlyle explained that they first needed to win the war so he could reclaim his title as Crown Prince, which was made more difficult by the Empire's incompetence, as the Empire's army had suffered too much damage. Asha asked if it was Carlyle who always said that they did not have enough troops, to which Carlyle replied that it was quite possible to use the military support of the nobles and Templars. Looking deeply into Asha's eyes with a smile, Carlyle stated that he only wanted her to be the first person he turned to for help. This shocked Asha. The girl's cheeks slightly blushed, because in this she again caught a hint that she was special to Carlyle. Unaware of Asha's inner confusion, Carlyle continued and explained that the Empire and Pervaz armies had fought together before, so they could easily cover each other's weaknesses, and Carlyle himself was very different from Kendrick, so Asha could rest easy because the rewards for her efforts would not disappoint her. Asha agreed, asking for a written agreement and also responding that she would have had no choice in the matter anyway. The latter shocked Carlyle, and he hastened to assure Asha that he would under no circumstances punish her for refusing. Asha hastened to assure Carlyle that the reason for her agreement was not fear of punishment, but trust in Carlyle. This made Carlyle laugh a little. The man stated that he couldn't believe that everything was really that simple. He stood up from the couch, extended his hand to Asha, and offered to have another great fight. Asha extended her hand in response, saying that she would play the role of a reliable wife, and the agreement was sealed with a handshake. After the decision was made for Pervaz's army to participate in the war with the South, the inhabitants began to prepare to fight and were determined to win. Dorothea and Cecilia also packed their things because they also needed to leave for the capital to provide some kind of support. Asha walked through the gallery of the castle, stopping in front of her and Carlyle's joint portraits. Asha regretfully believed that things were already coming to an end. All that was left was to win the war with the South, after which it would be possible to complete the marriage contract. Asha looked down and clutched the sword Carlyle had given her, thinking that she would have to give it her all on the battlefield, as it would help distract her from the approaching sadness. Asha's thoughts were interrupted by Nina, who called out to her, to which Asha quickly collected her thoughts and asked what had happened. Nina handed Asha a letter, explaining that it was for Asha and appeared to be from Gabriel. Opening the letter, Asha was very surprised. Why would Gabriel suddenly write her a letter, especially at such a moment? And the letter contained a request for a meeting. Gabriel, meanwhile, did not plan to return to the capital, but decided to explore the abandoned lands with the novice. Gabriel made his way deeper into the abandoned lands, clearly knowing where he needed to go, and the novice excitedly asked if Gabriel was going to visit that very place again. Gabriel left the novice's question unanswered, stopping and trying to catch something invisible in the air. Soon, however, it became clear that Gabriel was catching the dark energy that permeated the air around him. The acolyte asked excitedly why Gabriel didn't just want to absorb all this dark energy, since it could help with the matter with Carlyle. Clenching the dark energy he had gathered into a fist, Gabriel noted with regret that he couldn't do it. The novice, not satisfied with this answer, asked why Gabriel was still hesitating, since they had been in these lands for a week already. Gabriel ignored the question, thinking that before he would have used all the dark energy without any hesitation, without thinking about the consequences for other people. But now his thoughts returned to Asha more and more often. Instead of answering, Gabriel expressed interest in what had happened to the letter he had sent to Asha, but the novice replied that the answer had not yet arrived. Standing next to the circle that had a large concentration of dark energy, Gabriel thought that if he used this power, he could destroy Pervaz in an instant. But if Asha sided with him, then this would not be necessary. Gabriel folded his hands in a prayerful gesture and asked God to guide Gabriel and Asha along the right path. Meanwhile, in the south, things were going very badly for the Empire. All around was a scorched desert, spattered with blood and bones lying around. Carlyle and Asha arrived in the south, and Carlyle could only describe what was happening around him in one way: chaos. Turning to Asha, Carlyle noted that if the territories were in such a state now that they had already arrived as quickly as possible, then at this rate, most of the Empire would suffer major losses due to the war with the South, to which Asha asked why not strike back with the Allied forces they had managed to gather. Asha also explained that if they could suppress the South now, the enemy would flee without having time to gather resources, and the Empire's army would be able to gain a lot if they did so. Carlyle looked at Asha with pride, smirking and saying that Pervaz specialized in just such actions. Giles intervened in Carlyle and Asha's conversation, stating that they would soon receive an answer from Emperor Kendrick, and before that, they needed to decide on further tactics. Carlyle, just in case, asked Giles about the state of the forces and the morale of the troops, to which he received the answer that everyone was in good spirits and almost not tired, because the journey was leisurely and the weather was excellent. Carlyle smiled contentedly and stated that in that case, they should do as Asha suggested and break through the enemy's rear line that day. Carlyle formed his troops, and Asha mused that since the outpost had been captured 20 days ago, it had only taken the Southern Alliance a couple of days. The units of Pervaz and the Empire coordinated their actions, agreeing to act together, covering each other, and helping to break through closer to the enemy army, not allowing the enemy units to regroup. The squads went forward, and Asha, remaining next to Carlyle, asked if he was afraid. Carlyle asked in surprise what exactly Asha meant, and Asha asked if Carlyle was afraid that so many people were following him. Giles, standing next to her, didn't understand why Asha suddenly decided to ask what he considered to be such a stupid question, but Carlyle replied that he was indeed afraid. Carlyle explained that he couldn't help but be afraid, because no matter what decision he made, someone would still die. Looking after his warriors, Carlyle said that it was for this very reason that he had to remain a self-confident commander. Carlyle continued that this was necessary so that he could take responsibility for all those who died and be able to honor them, words that shocked Asha and Giles. Asha smiled sincerely and said that if she died, she would absolutely remain a part of Carlyle's victory, to which Carlyle asked why Asha would die. Carlyle said that Asha could not die because she was obligated to share with Carlyle the responsibility for the lives of all their people. Asha asked why her, to which Carlyle replied that it was because she was his wife. Carlyle's answer left Asha confused and upset. The girl thought that she could not expect anything from Carlyle. He only asked her to support him, since they were still married. Asha clenched her fist to get her emotions under control and replied dispassionately that Carlyle was right. It was a wife's duty to support her husband, and she had forgotten about that for a while. Carlyle came closer to Asha, put his hand on her shoulder, and said that his life was now in her hands, asking her to take care of him, which again knocked Asha off balance emotionally. A voice came from the crowd, calling to Carlyle and telling him that everything was ready, so Carlyle gave the order to move out, and the Empire's troops and their allies did indeed go on the offensive, led by Carlyle and Asha, riding swiftly forward on horseback across the desert left after the war. Meanwhile, Matthias returned to the capital and immediately ran to look for the Empress to complain to her about how hard it was for him. The Empress was, to put it mildly, unhappy with the situation, since everything turned out completely differently than she had originally imagined. All the soldiers sent to the front with Matthias were defeated, and rumors very unpleasant for the Empress were spreading throughout society. Information was spread among the aristocrats that Matthias had hastily left the battlefield, so when she asked the Empress for help in the military operations, she received refusals and apologies. Moreover, the Empress was extremely concerned about the fact that Carlyle had been sent south, since this could further disrupt her plans, which the Empress told her son. But the Empress's concerns were not understood by Matthias, who said that he wanted to go and rest. Matthias complained that his back hurt after the long carriage ride, but the Empress still tried to convey to her son that now was not the time to rest and complain. The Empress's lack of understanding angered Matthias, and he almost shouted that he had to rest because his back hurt a lot. But Matthias was interrupted mid-sentence by the Empress rising from her chair and clenching her hands into fists, showing her son how much she was displeased with him. Matthias tensed, thinking that the Empress was about to hit him, but in reality she only walked up to her son, stroked his cheek, and told him that he really needed to focus on the problem at hand. With a grim expression, the Empress told Matthias that if Carlyle won this war, he would be given back his title of Crown Prince. This came as sudden news to Matthias, and he exclaimed that he had heard nothing about it. In a panic, Matthias stated that he had already traveled south as required, encountered a lot of difficulties, and believed that there was nothing he could do. The Empress was furious at her son's reaction, because Matthias himself had brought it all to the point that he was completely useless, and he also didn't want to do anything on his own. And on the southern border, fierce battles were taking place under the leadership of Carlyle. Unlike Matthias, Carlyle actively participated in the battles, striking blows at his enemies, meeting among them familiar faces of those to whom Carlyle had previously shown mercy. At this moment, a new enemy was sneaking up behind Carlyle, wanting to strike him in the back and thus finish off Carlyle. But also on the battlefield was Asha, Carlyle's wife, who was no stranger to watching his back from those who wanted to take advantage of his weaknesses. Asha blocked a blow that was aimed at Carlyle's back, but the opponent decided to laugh at her, saying that the former crown prince seemed to be more obsessed with women than it might seem. Not feeling any danger, the man decided to egg Asha on and asked why Carlyle needed such a girl on the battlefield, clearly hinting that Asha was just warming Carlyle's bed. The man continued to say that he was madly in love with women, but he would not trust his life to any of them, and then stated that he could spare Asha if after them he did not have time to finish, because the offer to spare Asha made Carlyle laugh very much. Turning towards Asha and the suicide bomber, Carlyle asked Asha with a kind smile if she heard the man say he would spare her. This interference outraged the man. He declared that Carlyle was a damn ignorant prince, and he would definitely cut Carlyle's head off his shoulders. While the man was distracted, Asha counterattacked and knocked his huge sword out of his hands, thereby completely disarming him and taking the advantage for herself. Asha then delivered another successful blow to the man's neck, who then fell to the ground, and Carlyle asked with a grin who was the insolent one now. Carlyle told Asha that he felt even more at ease now, and Asha replied that, as she had said, it was her duty as a wife to protect her husband. With a cold, distant gaze, completely focused on the battlefield, Asha tried to wipe the drops of her opponent's blood from her face. Carlyle admired Asha at that moment, swallowing hard and getting lost in his thoughts for a few seconds in admiration of this girl. Asha walked forward, noticed that Carlyle had not followed her, turned to him and asked him not to let his guard down. The battle continued. Asha struck, blocked, used her shield, struck again, more and more, leaving no enemy in her path. A rival was approaching Asha from behind, wanting to plunge a sword into her back, and the girl did not see him. He was almost celebrating his victory and did not even hide. But at the last second, Asha noticed the approaching danger in her peripheral vision. Asha turned sharply and managed to put her sword to the enemy's neck, but there were still too many enemies around. One of them was about to take advantage of the fact that Asha was fighting another enemy, but at that moment, Carlyle intervened. It only took one precise blow for Carlyle to get rid of the threat, covering Asha's back. Carlyle apologized to Asha with a grin for being distracted for a second, to which the girl advised him to remain calm and alert. Looking around, Asha noted that if they continued in the same spirit, they would quickly reach the border with the south, to which Carlyle replied that this was what Asha herself had planned. Giving himself and Asha a few moments to rest, Carlyle whistled, calling the horses with this whistle. As the animals approached, Carlyle, in the heat of battle, suggested that Asha go and crush all their opponents. Asha and Carlyle mounted their horses, after which Asha agreed to Carlyle's proposal, noting that it would be easier if they struck before the enemy forces had time to regroup. Meanwhile, at the headquarters of the Southern Alliance, they were discussing in raised tones the fact that Carlyle should not have been in this war due to his expulsion from the capital. Trying to decide what to do next, it was suggested to try to negotiate and retreat before it was too late. It was said that Kendrick apparently called Carlyle because he couldn't handle the Alliance forces, and this greatly angered Queen Paleso, who was also involved in the war, as she was extremely surprised that after Carlyle's intervention, their army began to lose so much, especially considering that Carlyle had fewer soldiers than the Alliance. The Queen said that the plan with the offer of negotiations should be followed, but the Allies countered that only the victors could offer negotiations. The Queen was indignant and asked if her allies thought that they would all die here now, to which she received the answer that they should not have opposed the Empire from the very beginning. The Queen sank into despair, trying to find in her head at least some way out of the current situation, but to no avail, nothing sensible came to mind. And Gabriel and his disciple continued to explore the abandoned lands in order to carry out his not-so-bright plans. As he walked forward, Gabriel thought that in all this time he had only been able to find one source of dark energy. At the moment of such sad thoughts, Gabriel noticed that a carrier pigeon was flying towards him with a reply from Asha. It was unexpected, but brought a lot of positive emotions. Inspired, Gabriel opened the letter, but it did not please him, because Asha wrote that she was going south with Carlyle, so she could not meet Gabriel yet. Clutching the letter in rage, Gabriel thoughtfully said that apparently this was Asha's answer to his prayers. Deciding that nothing could hold him back any longer, Gabriel began to gather dark energy in his hands to deliver his blow. Gabriel believed that this was the will of God, and this was his path, which meant that he could do with dark energy everything that the priest had not dared to do before. Just a week later, the forces of the Southern Alliance began to surrender to the Empire's troops, raising white flags, and a celebration was held in the camp of the Empire's troops in the evening, where they honored Carlyle, raising glasses to him and his wise command of the army. Lionel smiled and noted that Carlyle had given it his all, but Carlyle said that everyone had done a great job, not just him. Lionel added that everyone knew they could trust Carlyle on the battlefield, and everyone around them agreed. Carlyle looked thoughtfully at his glass of wine and noted that it was only through cooperation that they had managed to achieve victory, but there were still things that needed to be resolved. Giles noted with a smile that this was only the beginning, because as soon as they managed to recover from the damage, Carlyle should be given back the title of Crown Prince. Carlyle said thoughtfully that it was unlikely that Kendrick would be able to take the title of Crown Prince from Matthias as easily as he could from Carlyle, to which Giles replied that Carlyle should be wary of any actions the Empress took. Giles noted that Matthias himself was nothing special, but the Empress could be a serious enemy, which Carlyle couldn't help but agree with. Giles said that the Empress would do anything, hiding behind Matthias, because a mother who saw a threat to her child is the most terrible thing one can face. And Carlyle did not quite agree with this, thinking that even if Matthias died, the Empress would still find a way to gain more power. Carlyle chose not to pursue the matter further, saying that in any case, they could only hope that the Empress would not have time to strike first. Carlyle said that he needed to think it over carefully, but now was the time to celebrate, and everyone listened to him, raising their glasses and giving in to the joy of victory. Giles, after taking part in the celebration for a short time, tried to disappear unnoticed, as he had secret affairs that required his attention. Hiding from prying eyes, and showing great caution in doing so, he crept into his own tent. A young man was already waiting for him in the tent, glad that the wait was over, and Giles apologized for the inconvenience caused, because if he had left the party earlier, Carlyle might have suspected something. The young man replied that it was okay since Carlyle had managed to win, and Giles asked how the situation was in the kingdom of Carter. The young man said that according to their reports, Duke Axis had fallen ill and Count Damien had seized the Duke's power. Damien Axis, the new Duke of the Kingdom of Carter, was the one who told the Queen that Carlyle would not return to the imperial capital, which triggered the war. It was Damien who, at a meeting with the Queen, announced that Carlyle had been stripped of his title of Crown Prince. And it was Damien who shared with everyone the news that Carlyle had been exiled to the north, away from the capital. Damien did all this for a reason. He was in collusion with the people of the Empire and acted exactly as it was beneficial to Giles. Giles smiled and thought to himself that he was very glad that Cecilia was on their side, because it was she who took care of everything, and it was this girl who was able to recruit Damien. The papers Giles showed Cecily when they discussed Carlyle's need to become emperor described the situation in the Southern Lands, a war with which Giles wanted to use to restore Carlyle's title of Crown Prince. He had planned this conflict in advance, removing Duke Axis from the way, since he was a principled supporter of the Southern Lands Alliance. The young man convinced Giles that Damien wanted a completely different fate for his people if the agreements reached with Giles up to this point remained in force. Giles confirmed that once Carlyle became emperor, relations with the Kingdom of Carter would be considered purely friendly. Giles stated that thanks to Damien, the Empire managed to start this war quietly, while demonstrating the complete incompetence of Matthias, against whom Carlyle looked like an indispensable ruler. The young man bowed, silently saying goodbye to Giles, and Giles thought that if Carlyle found out about this plan, he would feel guilty, because Carlyle was the kind of person who felt very sorry for others. Giles remembered Carlyle complaining that if Kendrick had truly cared about his people, he wouldn't have turned his back on them. Giles thought that this was a very good quality for an emperor, but it was not a fact that Carlyle would not change once he achieved his goal. The young man asked to give him the document they had agreed on earlier, and Giles handed over the scroll, which contained an order to leave Damien's title and powers as they are now. The young man hastened to deliver the document to the Duke. In the happy thought that everything had gone exactly according to his plan, Giles left his tent and came across a very unkind Asha, who demanded an explanation from him. Asha explained that she noticed a suspicious person and decided to follow him, and strangely enough, this suspicious person went straight to Giles's tent. Giles didn't like Asha's words. He indignantly asked if she had been spying on him, but the girl calmly replied that yes, that was exactly what she had been doing. Asha said that she did not rule out the possibility that even Giles could betray Carlyle, and this only increased the degree of indignation in Giles. Asha, without losing her composure, asked to explain how Giles could start a war in his own empire. Asha said that Carlyle needed to know about this. Otherwise, how could he become emperor later? To which Giles yelled at Asha to shut up. Giles said there was no point in telling the truth after Carlyle had achieved the desired result. And anyway, how dare some pathetic Marchioness judge matters concerning the becoming of emperor? Giles became even more heated and, pointing a finger at Asha, declared that it was very strange that she was the one trying to accuse him, Giles, of betrayal when she was the one person Carlyle trusted the least. To Asha's surprised question, Giles replied that there was a pendant on her neck given to her by Carlyle. In the pendant, there was a mana stone, on which a spell was cast that allowed Asha's location to be tracked at all times. Asha couldn't answer, and Giles added that Carlyle believed that Asha would be the one to betray him someday. Asha remembered Carlyle saying that this pendant would save her life someday, and Giles smirkingly saying that Carlyle never trusted her and she was being so arrogant without knowing it. Asha's hands hung limply at her sides, trying to figure out if what Giles had said was true, if she could feel betrayed, because it might be natural to suspect her. Her betrayal could be the most dangerous for Carlisle. Having managed to calm down, Asha asked if she didn't have the right to be disappointed in Carlisle if he provoked a war in his own country, considering that he still couldn't have not known about it. Giles and Asha were about to attack each other. Giles stated that if Matthias became emperor, the country would be mired in much worse wars, to which Asha responded that there might be another way to return the title of Crown Prince to Carlisle. Giles and Asha's heated argument was suddenly interrupted by Carlisle walking up to them unnoticed and asking what was going on. Carlisle was surprised, because neither Asha nor Giles were the kind of people who would just raise their voices at someone in a place like this. Giles immediately apologized and tried to explain it by saying that he had been drinking a little, but Carlisle looked at Asha's reaction, which was obviously strange. Asha stood there dejected, and he asked her point blank if she wanted to tell him what had happened. Avoiding eye contact with Carlisle, Asha said she had spoken to Giles about her disappointment in Carlisle. Carlisle asked in surprise who was disappointed in him, to which he received a very unexpected answer: Asha herself. Giles tried to end the conversation by telling Carlisle not to pay attention to Asha's words, since she was also a little drunk, but Carlisle asked the girl to continue. Asha finally looked up at Carlisle and asked indignantly how it was possible to provoke a war in his own country for the sake of returning the title of Crown Prince. Asha asked if Carlisle really didn't feel anything as he looked at the refugees on the road to the southern border. These words shocked Carlisle. He knew nothing about the war being provoked, so what Asha said puzzled him greatly. But after a moment of stupor, Carlisle remembered that Giles had come to him with a conversation on this topic, and this led to very specific thoughts. Giles said they needed an incident that would show Carlisle was indispensable to get the support they needed. Carlisle then realized that Giles was proposing to start a war in the south, but he replied that this war, on the contrary, must be prevented, and forbade doing anything like that. Carlisle realized that Giles had decided to forget about his prohibition, and he gritted his teeth and thought that if Asha had been present at that conversation, she would not have thought that Carlisle could do such a thing. But Carlisle could not blame Giles for taking such a step, since ignorance of the war that had been provoked did not relieve Carlisle of responsibility for it. Carlisle apologized to Asha for disappointing her because she followed him out of trust, and it turned out that he had broken that trust. But such apologies only made things worse. Clenching her teeth, Asha took the pendant off her neck and said that she trusted Carlisle, but she regretted that she could not become a person that Carlisle himself could trust. Handing the pendant to Carlisle, Asha said that even without using such things, he could easily find out where exactly she was. The realization that Asha had learned about the pendant's properties frightened Carlisle almost more than the news of the war that had been provoked. Asha turned away from Carlisle, stating that since the war was over, the army of Pervaz had accomplished its purpose, so Carlisle could return to the capital and they would immediately return back to Pervaz. Asha wanted to leave, but Carlisle caught her by the elbow and exclaimed that he himself had long forgotten about this medallion and would like to introduce her as his confidant in the capital. Asha turned around and said gloomily that if she followed Carlisle, she would only become an obstacle to his recovery, so she would carefully check the divorce papers and send them to Carlisle. He need not worry about that. Freeing herself from Carlisle's grip, Asha turned and headed towards her tent, apologizing for having to leave first. Carlisle and Giles watched the girl for a moment, after which Carlisle turned his attention to Giles. Carlisle said, with great displeasure, that he and Giles clearly had something to talk about that night. And after what was said, Carlisle turned his cold gaze to Giles and declared that they needed to discuss everything, starting with the war plan, which was not approved, but was carried out, ending with the fact that Asha somehow magically learned about the properties of the pendant given to her. The war, however, did indeed work out exactly as Giles had planned, with Carlisle's popularity rising dramatically while Matthias's popularity plummeted. Carlisle's army remained in the south to help the inhabitants restore the destroyed territories, which pacified the discontent of the citizens of the south as well. But Carlisle's trust was lost for Giles, despite all his past merits and smoothly executed plan, because he did everything recently behind Carlisle's back. The people of the Empire celebrated Carlisle, truly seeing in him a man who could become a future emperor, especially in light of Matthias's failures. Carlisle and Lionel were in the office, and Lionel was just happily saying that Carlisle had been able to turn the tide of the war very quickly. The status of the defender of the South had been confirmed, and the people's support for Carlyle was now stronger than it had ever been. Carlyle did not share Lionel's joy, looking ahead with a gloomy gaze, which forced Lionel to ask if something was weighing on Carlyle and if it was because of Giles. Carlyle shook his head, replying that the gratitude of the people made one think that Giles had been right in his actions. Carlyle said that Lionel had once said that Giles had a hard time supporting Carlyle, to which Lionel nodded and said that maybe Giles' way wasn't the most ethical, but perhaps the fastest. Lionel leaned over Carlyle with concern and asked if this was what was bothering the man. Carlyle just smiled bitterly, thinking to himself that he was actually continuing to remember the last words that Asha had said to him before she left. Asha thanked Carlyle for everything he had done for Pervaz over the past 2 years and wished him to be a wise and merciful ruler. Carlyle said thoughtfully that although he and Asha weren't divorced yet, he felt like it was already over. Lionel said thoughtfully that after Asha's departure to Pervaz, rumors had already started to circulate about a remarriage. All the aristocrats were rushing to announce themselves with burning eyes, not only Dupré. In Carlyle's mind, he immediately remembered Giles telling him that the time had come for a suitable marriage, and the letter from Count Dupré, who wrote about Cecilia's feelings for Carlyle, and the many other aristocrats who wanted to marry him to their daughters. Carlyle put his hand to his face wearily and exhaled, thinking that Asha, who needed money from him, turned out to be the most straightforward and honest person in the end. Carlyle noted with regret that while he was in Pervaz, these questions had somehow passed him by, but Lionel replied that Carlyle should think about what was happening in the palace and in the capital, and not about Pervaz. Carlyle shook his head, telling Lionel that he knew that himself, but he thought to himself that he wasn't sure he could, because no matter how much he tried to distract himself, his thoughts still returned to Asha. Meanwhile, Asha had already managed to return to Pervaz, breathing a sigh of relief because she was finally home. Decker, who met her, noted, rubbing his hands, that Asha had returned too quickly. He had expected the girl to be gone for more than a year. Asha responded with only a short "I see," which alarmed Decker, as did her general state. Decker asked worriedly what exactly had happened, since Asha had not said a word on the way to Pervaz, and now she was limiting herself to only short answers. Asha turned away from Decker silently, unable to find the words to describe what exactly had gone wrong. Decker didn't want to leave everything as it was now, so he insisted on the need for a conversation. He was very worried about Asha. Already in the castle, Asha and Decker entered the office. Asha looked lost and did not look at Decker. The man asked if Asha understood what he wanted to talk about. Asha suggested that perhaps the topic of conversation might be her early arrival in Pervaz, but Decker replied that he knew her too well, so it was strange to him that she remained silent on the way to Pervaz. Asha folded her arms across her chest, apologized, and explained her silence by saying that she needed to think about everything that had happened. Decker said that judging by Asha's behavior, something happened between her and Carlyle, to which Asha nodded. Asha admitted that she had learned that the war that had broken out in the South had been provoked by Carlyle's supporters, which greatly surprised Decker. With tears in her eyes, Asha said that she just couldn't accept it. They sacrificed people's lives to gain power. Asha didn't understand how it was possible to use people like weapons. The girl covered her eyes with her hand, and the girl's state, along with what was said, angered Decker. Taking her hand away from her eye, Asha smiled slightly sadly, and thought that, apparently, she too was just a weapon for Carlyle, which, having fulfilled its purpose, simply drove away. This must have been very convenient for Carlyle. Decker patted Asha on the shoulder, saying that she was doing well, and this greatly surprised the girl, bringing her out of her sad thoughts. Decker continued to praise the girl, saying that she did everything right, and her father would definitely be proud of her now. Asha shared her doubts that she was not sure if it was right to end her relationship with Carlyle like this, and go through all this. Decker assured Asha with a smile that the decision was absolutely correct. They do not know what kind of people live in the capital of the empire, but in Pervaz, they must live according to their beliefs. And if Asha had turned a blind eye to what was happening, there would have been more problems in the future. Asha smiled. Decker's words really made the girl feel a little better. Decker suggested that she be glad that the relationship with Carlyle had ended while the man was inspired by the victory. Decker said he understood that Asha was in trouble for her help in the war with the South, but this help could be considered a way of paying Carlyle for his help in Pervaz. Now they were even. Decker said that it was time for Asha to find her happiness, which made the girl think, but soon smile and answer that it really was time. And in the capital, the Empress, together with Matthias, came to Gabriel, who had managed to return back after all. The novice led the Empress and Matthias to Gabriel, who was playing the piano while waiting for them. Turning to the Empress and Matthias, who had entered, Gabriel smiled and said that he had been waiting for the Empress, inviting the newcomers to sit down on the sofa. The Empress got straight to the point and said that Carlisle was soon to enter the capital with a magnificent triumphal ceremony. Gabriel asked if Kendrick really wanted to return the title of Crown Prince to Carlisle, and the Empress confirmed this, stating that the Emperor intended to do so immediately. The Empress noted that Kendrick was a very narrow-minded person, and Gabriel noted with a smile that the Emperor's decisions affect the future of the Empire, which is why they need the advice of priests. Gabriel placed his hand on his heart and said that thanks to the efforts of the Brotherhood, the number of believers who shared their beliefs had grown, and Matthias was risking everything for the Holy Empire. The Empress smiled sincerely and thanked Gabriel for such words towards Matthias. The Empress took Matthias by the hand and with the same smile said that she and Matthias would definitely create a holy empire with their own hands. Gabriel's expression did not change, remaining just as benevolent. But the man thought to himself that the Empress was just a stupid woman, because it was he who would create the holy empire, and not the Empress and Matthias. Remaining calm, Gabriel said that the most important thing for them now would be to protect Matthias, and Matthias emotionally added that yes, because he is the first target for the enemies. Gabriel said that he would appoint priests with divine power to protect Matthias, and under their protection, neither ordinary knights nor assassins would be able to reach Matthias. Matthias asked what would happen if Kendrick suddenly did not approve of such protection, to which the Empress replied that Matthias should not worry about it. The Empress reassured Matthias that she and Gabriel already had a plan, but Gabriel looked at Matthias and was clearly unhappy. The mere thought of someone like Matthias ruling the Holy Empire made Gabriel furious and his blood boil. Gabriel closed his eyes and exhaled, calming down, thinking that it was okay. Let the puppet live while it does what it should, and Gabriel would have time to find a candidate for the place of the Emperor. Matthias and the Empress returned to the palace. Gabriel fulfilled his promise and assigned additional security to Matthias, which greatly strained the entire court, including his sisters. Charlize and Josephine were sitting on the couch and wondering what exactly was going on around them. Josephine noticed that the atmosphere in the castle was very strange. She was wondering why the priests suddenly started guarding Matthias, to which Charlize suggested that their brother was being protected from something. Josephine thought that the reason for what was happening might be Carlisle, because if he were to return his title, then the sisters would also be in danger, and the Empress had not told them anything about it until now. Josephine stood up with a sigh and said that she and Charlize would have to figure this out on their own, using the information they both had. Carlisle arrived at the walls of the capital, thoughtfully looking over the wall where he needed to enter. Now there were quite a lot of thoughts in his head. There was a camp set up near the wall, where preparations were underway for the ceremony. Carlisle was reading reports when someone looked into his tent. The soldier who looked into Carlisle the letter, as she apparently wanted to use it later. Carlisle was surprised by this information, although he did not show it, but he thought that since Charlize and Josephine were rummaging through the trash, their situation was an emergency. Putting the letter in his pocket, Carlisle noted that the information about the conspiracy was indeed valuable, as was the news of Gabriel's involvement in it. Charlize and Josephine were delighted, smiling almost identically, and Josephine asked if Carlisle would protect them. Carlisle told them that he wasn't sure about that, as he knew that Charlize and Josephine had more important information, but apparently didn't plan on sharing that information with him. Charlize and Josephine were very confused because Carlisle knew about something they didn't want to reveal yet. Charlize asked Carlisle if he meant the information that concerned Kendrick and the Empress. When asked how he knew about this, Carlisle noted that no matter how hard the Empress tried to get rid of him, he still had eyes and ears in the Imperial Palace. Carlisle said that he knew Kendrick had lost his ability to conceive a child. Charlize blushed at Carlisle's directness, and Josephine replied that these rumors were circulating throughout the palace. With a grin, Carlisle continued and said that according to his informant, there were others involved in this matter, but it was Josephine and Charlize who should know best about it. Josephine asked Charlize to get another envelope that they had brought with them. Charlize actually took out the envelope, opening it but not yet handing it over to Carlisle, and asked if this was what he needed. The envelope was eventually handed to Carlisle, who carefully read the documents inside and noted with satisfaction that the cause of Kendrick's infertility was the drug, as Carlisle had suspected. With irrefutable evidence of the Empress's guilt, Carlisle headed towards Kendrick, who was drinking tea, still unaware of anything. Entering Kendrick's room, Carlisle thanked him for agreeing to such a sudden meeting with his son. Kendrick laughed and said that he couldn't refuse Carlisle when he asked him for a meeting with such a serious face, and asked what happened anyway. Carlisle sat down opposite Kendrick and, looking away, slightly lowering his head, said, hesitating, that the Empress was not entirely loyal to the Empire and to Kendrick himself. This news enraged Kendrick. He replied that the Empress was the mother of the Empire. All these years she had been faithfully by Kendrick's side, so there was no question of her suddenly deciding to betray the Emperor. Carlisle took out the letter with evidence of the Empress's conspiracy with the priests and held it over the fire to reveal the text. After the text appeared, Carlisle handed the letter to Kendrick, asking him to read it. Kendrick read the text of the letter, and now his anger was directed in a completely different direction. Lowering the paper, he furiously asked what all this meant. Carlisle explained that, judging by this letter, the Empress and Matthias intend to turn the Empire into a holy empire, and if this happens, the power of the Church will surpass the power of the imperial family. Kendrick clenched the paper in his fist and yelled that they wouldn't dare hand the country over to the snot-nosed priests. Carlisle noted that unfortunately that was not all, and Kendrick asked what could be worse, to which Carlisle handed him the following papers. Carlisle explained that these papers were a diary with recommended medicines and recipes of the former physician of the Imperial Palace. After reading these papers, Kendrick should have understood everything. Carlisle said that the Empress, in collusion with the physician, made Kendrick sterile to prevent the birth of a rival for Matthias. Kendrick was horrified by such news. He could not believe that everything that happened was the work of the Empress, who managed to pull everything off in such a way that Kendrick did not even suspect it. Kendrick jumped up furiously and declared that it was necessary to immediately kill the Empress, who certainly could not be forgiven for such actions. Carlisle stopped the enraged Kendrick, saying that it would be better to remove the Empress's limbs one by one, starting with Gabriel, the priests and nobles who supported the Empress, which would strip her of all her power. Carlisle suggested that he announce his return to the throne without warning, and that the Empress be locked up in a separate palace. Kendrick agreed with this plan. Carlisle turned and walked out of Kendrick's room, thinking that the Emperor could now handle the whole situation himself. Carlisle walked through the corridors and thought that the matter with the Empress was resolved, but there was still Gabriel and the priests assigned to Matthias as guards, although Carlisle at first thought that they were only disguised knights. On more than one occasion, Carlisle noticed that the servants in the palace were discussing the changed atmosphere in the palace, as well as the deterioration of Matthias's health. Such talk made Carlisle suspect that these priests were not actually using divine power, but something else entirely. In Pervaz, meanwhile, the soldiers were making their rounds of the castle, discussing how this year had once again been a very fruitful one, and wondering whether the festival would be held this year as well, when they suddenly noticed something strange. Right in front of them, dark energy began to swirl, and from it appeared two huge, incomprehensible creatures with evil intentions. On the other side, a dark portal opened, from which armed barbarians appeared. The soldiers had no choice but to try to give an alarm signal. News soon reached Asha about what exactly was happening in the castle, and this could not help but worry her, because they had only recently dealt with the barbarians. Asha closed her eyes and asked herself mentally why exactly in Pervaz such events were happening again, and why many lives would be taken again. Decker, who was reporting to Asha, noticed that the girl had withdrawn into herself and called out to her, asking if she had been listening to him. Decker said that magical animals and barbarians were jumping out of magic circles all over the castle, and asked where these circles could have come from. Asha handed Decker the letter she'd been holding in her hands, offering to look at what was written, explaining that it was a letter from Gabriel. The letter stated that since Carlyle had returned to the Imperial Palace, his supporters were under attack, so Asha should evacuate Pervaz for a while. The contents of the letter surprised Decker, because he thought that everything should have been resolved with Carlyle's return to the throne. Asha explained that this was logical. Carlyle's ill-wishers would not give up power so easily, and if Carlyle died, he would not be able to return to the throne, so a battle for power began, and Carlyle's supporters were also involved in this. Decker tried to find something positive, and noted that it would be good if Gabriel had a positive attitude towards Asha, since he could be asked for help, but Asha was not enthusiastic about this idea. Asha furiously tore the letter she was holding in her hands, greatly surprising Decker, who did not understand why the girl was suddenly angry. Asha explained her outburst of rage by the fact that, judging by that letter, Gabriel knew perfectly well what was going to happen. Moreover, he was the only one who could arrange something like that. The girl was outraged. How dare Gabriel harm Pervaz and its inhabitants? She was not going to forgive such actions. Decker asked what if it wasn't Gabriel's fault after all, because relying only on themselves in this situation could cost them their lives. Asha grimly replied to Decker that it was better to die alone than to be betrayed and cling to illusory hopes. Asha declared that she herself would be able to protect Pervaz and its inhabitants, which is what she had been doing until now, because for a long time she had had absolutely no help. Gabriel stood by the magic circle, thinking that the barbarian tribe should have already broken into Pervaz, and even though he had warned Asha of the impending danger, it was unlikely that she would have allowed herself to escape. Gabriel bowed in prayer, thinking that if Asha had responded to his invitation, then this would never have happened and she would be completely safe. Gabriel prayed that even though Asha was pursuing her own interests and Pervaz was justly punished, Asha would still remain safe and well. Gabriel's prayer was interrupted by the entry of a novice, who announced that Gabriel had a guest. Gabriel noted with displeasure that he had asked not to let anyone in, but the novice explained that the guest refused to leave until she met Gabriel. With a sigh, and realizing who was seeking a meeting, Gabriel said that he would approach the guest himself. As soon as Gabriel gave permission, the Empress burst into the hall with an indignant question about what all this meant. Without waiting for Gabriel's reaction, the Empress explained that Kendrick had suddenly officially announced the return of the title to Carlyle. The Empress added to her indignation by learning that Charlize and Josephine had recently met with Carlyle and could have revealed to him all of Gabriel and the Empress's plans. Gabriel placed his hand on the Empress's shoulder, leaned closer to her, and quietly but confidently said that even if their plans were revealed to Carlyle, they could still carry them out. The Empress was even somewhat unnerved by the gloom with which Gabriel said this. For a split second, the mask of the good priest slipped off, and what was underneath was truly frightening. And in the Imperial Palace, preparations were in full swing for the ceremony to restore Carlyle's title of Crown Prince. This ceremony was planned to be pompous. Lionel stood next to Carlyle, who was being fitted for a suit, and with a smile congratulated Carlyle on finally being given back the title of Crown Prince, to which Carlyle replied that the title had always been his. Carlyle thought with satisfaction that immediately after the title of Crown Prince was returned to him, the Empress would be imprisoned in her palace. While the Empress is being deprived of her freedom, a search will be conducted for Gabriel in order to deal with him as well. Carlyle looked in the mirror and thought that this was the perfect time to become Crown Prince again. Distracted from his thoughts about power, Carlyle suddenly asked Lionel a question that stumped him, asking why a man and a woman cannot be someone to each other if they are not spouses. When Lionel misunderstood, Carlyle explained that there were many types of relationships such as lovers, concubines, friends, vassals, and lords, but only marriage was legal, Carlyle wondered if it was possible to create a type of relationship that was less formal than marriage. Lionel still didn't quite understand what exactly Carlyle was asking about, but decided to clarify why he wanted it. Carlyle blushed, ruffling his hair at the back of his head, but remained silent, thinking that if such a relationship could be created, then even if he and Asha divorced, they could still stay together. But Carlyle's thoughts were interrupted by Giles, who ran into the office in an unusually excited state, declaring that he had urgent news. Carlyle turned around and asked Giles what could have happened to put him in such a state, so unusual for him. Giles started to answer that it had to do with Kendrick, but Vivian interrupted him, entering behind him with the words that His Majesty Emperor Kendrick had died. Vivian said that it happened while Kendrick was getting ready for dinner, and the news shocked everyone present. Carlyle stood in a stupor, not believing that this could happen now. He could not believe that Kendrick, his father, really died. Carlyle said that was nonsense, since only yesterday Kendrick had been completely healthy, but Giles replied that during the preparation for dinner, Kendrick's heart stopped before anyone could help him, and the Empress immediately closed access to the palace, gathered allies, and the church and Matthias's supporters agreed that he should take the throne. Carlyle smiled bitterly, stating that Kendrick, who had been in good health up until that point, had suddenly collapsed and died, and the church had agreed to the order of succession as if that was all it had been waiting for. The Empress gathered her supporters and sealed the palace. Carlyle was furious and ended his thoughts by saying that this was clearly a deliberate murder, and someone would definitely want answers. Giles said that, of course, when this became known, people would be interested in the causes of death. But, at this point, Vivian continued his explanation, saying that the Empress would sort everything out and simply suppress those who doubted anything. While the situation was being heatedly discussed, a carrier pigeon knocked on the window and brought some more news. Lionel opened the window, took the note from the bird, opened it, and read what the pigeon had brought them, and it was even worse news than what was happening now. Lionel's mood sank even lower than it had been before, and he said in shock that this had happened in such a tense situation. Lionel said that Pervaz was attacked by barbarians and monsters, which shocked Carlyle. Carlyle immediately asked when this happened and what losses Pervaz had suffered, to which Lionel replied that the note stated that Pervaz had suffered more damage than any territory had ever suffered before. Lionel had already realized what such news could lead to, as had Vivian, who tried to convey to Carlyle that now was not the time to think about Pervaz. Vivian said that now was the time to deal with the Empress, to act immediately before an imperial decree was issued that would tie their hands even more tightly. Giles and Vivian began to argue about what was best to do, because Giles was sure that it was unwise to openly oppose the Empress now, and Vivian believed that later, when Matthias took the throne, the situation would only get worse. Vivian stated that they first needed to take control of the palace and then expose the Empress's betrayal. Giles countered that it was better for Vivian to keep quiet if she was not ready to take responsibility, because in such situations, it was better to wait for the right moment. Lionel intervened, ending the argument, telling Carlyle that, as Vivian and Giles had said, Carlyle needed to focus on palace affairs. Lionel was about to go ask for help from the nearest baron, but Carlyle only asked Lionel whether Pervaz had indeed suffered great damage, and Lionel confirmed this by referring to what was written in the letter. Carlyle declared that if he raised his soldiers, they could capture the palace, but they would not be able to avoid bloodshed, at which point Pervaz would be captured by the barbarians. Carlyle's further words about his immediate departure to Pervaz shocked all three of his allies. Lionel couldn't help but ask if Carlyle was sure of his decision to go to Pervaz, to which Carlyle asked, since when Lionel had been discussing his orders and quickly left the room. Vivian put her hand to her forehead and said that since things were going this way, she would stay in the palace and try to find a way out. Giles, disappointed with Carlyle's actions, said that she could do whatever she wanted. Carlyle, practically running through the corridors of the castle, could only hope that Asha was okay. Carlyle vividly imagined the kind of carnage that could now take place in Pervaz, and he understood perfectly well that Asha would not remain on the sidelines. She would participate in the very hell, and these thoughts urged him to go to Pervaz as soon as possible. And in Pervaz, there really was a massacre. The number of monsters was not limited to the two that were initially seen during the walkthrough. The enemies were becoming more and more. Asha was truly in the thick of it, dealing blows to both monsters and barbarians, not sparing herself, and not afraid to die to protect Pervaz. Ashu was worried about how many casualties they had in Pervaz from this attack, because people fought back, but it was hard. They were faced with something they had never seen before. Bodies were falling all around, and Asha wasn't sure if they were her own or strangers. It looked like madness with so many deaths. Asha gritted her teeth and thought that even civilians, those who needed to be protected, were suffering in this battle, and she simply had to protect them all. Angry, Asha drew attention to herself by shouting that when someone enters the castle, they must first greet its owner. The rage that surged through Asha gave her a second wind, and she rushed with even greater enthusiasm to kill the monsters and barbarians who invaded her domain. This attitude of Asha inspired the soldiers of Pervaz, inspiring them to fight with even greater dedication, without self-pity, for the sake of protecting Pervaz. Decker gave the order to protect Asha and not retreat under any circumstances, also trying to raise the morale of his allies. A few days after Kendrick's death, the Empress sat on his throne and laughed smugly, completely satisfied with how everything had gone. Gabriel stood next to the throne, and the Empress, with a sincere smile, shared with him that the sight before her was truly beautiful. The Empress smugly declared that the pig-like emperor was dead and that she was now in charge, to which Gabriel, with a slight bow, replied that God was leading the faithful along the best path that he knew. The Empress replied that she had always known this, because if it had not been for God's help, they would never have been able to get rid of Kendrick. It turned out that after talking with Carlyle, Kendrick still couldn't hold back and came straight to her, the Empress, with accusations that she had made him sterile. The Empress pretended not to understand anything, but in the meantime, she was wondering how Kendrick could have found out about this. The only option that came to the Empress's mind was that Carlyle told Kendrick everything, and then Charlize and Josephine told him. Seeing the Empress's reaction, Kendrick angrily stated that it looked like she was trying to come up with an excuse for herself. Kendrick told the Empress that no matter what excuse she had for herself, he had evidence of her guilt, which would be made public the next day at dinner. The Empress, having managed to pull herself together, said with a calm expression on her face that in that case she would prove that all of Kendrick's accusations were just unfounded slander. With the same serene calm, the Empress curtsied to Kendrick and headed for the exit. The Empress stopped near the door, smiled unkindly, and wished Kendrick sweet dreams. The next day, Gabriel came to Kendrick for prayer, and the Emperor told him that he had accumulated a lot of questions for the High Priest. Gabriel promised to answer each of the questions, but first, since the medicine had not worked on Kendrick completely, he offered to bless him for a long, long life. The Emperor agreed and ordered Gabriel to begin praying as soon as possible. Gabriel raised his hand to Kendrick's head, cast a spell, and dark energy erupted from his fingers. Kendrick looked at Gabriel with a clouded gaze, his head wreathed in ribbons of dark energy that was clearly affecting the Emperor. Gabriel became convinced that his magic was working on Kendrick and laid down a delayed order that Kendrick would die while preparing for dinner that day. Having completed his ritual, Gabriel stood next to Kendrick with an innocent smile, while the Emperor woke up somewhat disoriented. Gabriel bowed, and Kendrick, putting his palm to his forehead, thought that he had not remembered the prayer at all. This seemed strange to the man, but he justified it by saying that he could have simply fallen asleep. And now the hour of preparation for the solemn ceremony of returning the title of Crown Prince to Carlisle had arrived. Servants were scurrying around Kendrick, helping him get ready for this event. Kendrick shared with the servants that Gabriel's prayers had indeed had a remarkable effect, as his hangover had completely disappeared, and he was now ready to avenge Vivian during dinner. At that moment, Kendrick suddenly grabbed his heart, feeling unbearable pain in his chest. Kendrick fell face down on the floor almost immediately, first trying to hold himself up with his staff, but then dropping it from his weakened hand, causing a commotion among the servants. The servants tried to do something to save Kendrick, but they didn't have time. Gabriel's order, created by dark magic, was carried out. The Empress, with a satisfied smile, told Gabriel that he was a true servant of God, an angel sent to save this corrupt land. The Empress noted that Gabriel was not only able to get rid of Kendrick, but also to organize a war against Pervaz in such a timely manner, the latter of whom, however, Gabriel was clearly not proud. The Empress asked whether Carlisle was heading specifically to Pervaz, and Gabriel confirmed this. The Empress leaned thoughtfully on her arm and said that apparently Carlisle had feelings for Asha Pervaz, which only played into their hands. Dropping her mask of benevolence, the Empress said that it would be nice if Josephine and Charlize could share such joy with the Empress, thinking that she had not expected at all that her daughters would betray her and go over to Carlisle's side. But Josephine and Charlize managed to disappear before the Empress could react, which irritated her, so she gave orders to Gabriel to find these girls and return them to the palace so that they could be punished or simply sold to another kingdom. Gabriel nodded and reassured the Empress that the priests were already busy searching for Charlize and Josephine, and it was a matter of a short time before they would be found. The Empress chose to leave Gabriel, and he, looking after her, thought that she was not at all concerned about Carlyle's departure to Pervaz, but Gabriel himself was interested in what motives had pushed Carlyle to do this. Gabriel wondered if Carlyle was truly worried about Asha Pervaz, but he quickly reassured himself that God would never allow their union. Gabriel came to the conclusion that Carlyle had most likely gone to Pervaz out of concern for the servants and resources left there, and not because of Asha. Carlyle, meanwhile, had managed to enter the territory of Pervaz. The village did not look badly damaged at all. There were no signs of fighting. But as Carlyle rode closer to the castle, he realized how wrong he had been in his conclusions, made only from the appearance of the village, because everything was very serious. Carlyle looked at the main gate of the castle in confusion, the towers of which were covered in cracks. Crows were flying around, and it seemed that one could see dark energy entangling the area around the castle. The closer Carlyle got to the castle itself, the worse the area looked, and the more devastated it was around. There were clearly many victims. As he approached the entrance, Carlyle noted that there was no one around. Although he had warned of his arrival, the situation frightened the man. A premonition told him that something had happened to Asha. Not daring to open the doors himself, Carlyle called out questioningly if there was anyone there at all. The castle doors slid open and were soon thrown open, revealing an even worse picture to Carlyle. There were wounded soldiers all around, whom servants were trying to help, and on the floor lay the dead, covered with white sheets. Carlyle's appearance caused a stir among the servants, some of whom immediately threw themselves at his feet, and the maids asked Carlyle to save Asha, who had risked her life fighting for them all. Carlyle, unable to contain his emotions, exclaimed questioningly what had happened here and why he was being asked to save Asha. One of the soldiers, whose condition was also far from normal, explained that strange magic circles had appeared all over the castle, from which monsters and barbarians had emerged. The soldier continued to say that no one knows where these circles came from, who could have drawn them, and in the most inconspicuous places. With tears in his eyes, the soldier said that Asha protected everyone. Although what was happening was more like the coming of demons, she did not spare herself for them. The soldier explained that they were unable to protect Asha. Everyone around was depressed. People could not hold back their tears. Carlyle looked around, clenched his fists, trying to control his emotions and not give in to the general panic, and asked where Asha was. The head maid, whose arm was injured, came out to Carlyle and said in her usual calm tone that she would show Carlyle out. The maid's next words seemed to hit Carlyle like a blow, because she said that Asha was now unconscious. The maid led Carlyle to the door of the room he had previously occupied, but before he could ask a question, the maid explained to him that they had placed Asha there because the door and bed in her own quarters had been destroyed. Asha was lying on the bed, all in bandages. It seemed that there was not a single undamaged place left on the girl. Nina was sitting next to her, hypnotizing her mistress with her gaze in the hope that she would wake up any minute. But Asha did not regain consciousness. Nina was very surprised to see Carlyle staring at Asha in shock, unable to take his eyes off her. With trembling hands, Carlyle wanted to touch Asha, but did not dare, sitting down next to her, and hesitantly asked Nina about the girl's condition. Nina replied that Asha had a lot of wounds all over her body, several fractures, but none of this threatened her life, to which Carlyle asked why in that case Asha did not wake up. With a dull look, Nina replied that during the battle, Asha had hit one of the barbarians, but suddenly black smoke burst out of it and hit Asha straight away. Carlyle asked what the black smoke was, but Nina, with tears in her eyes, said that none of them knew what it was exactly. But after being hit by this smoke, Asha lost consciousness. Her pulse became weak, and the girl never came to. Nina tried to stop crying and wiped away her tears, and Carlyle thought that apparently some strange magic was used on Asha. Carlyle looked at Asha with regret. He couldn't find a place where someone else's magic could have gotten to, but even without that, he didn't like the girl's condition. She seemed to have gone out. She no longer had that fervor that she had during their battles together. Carlyle asked the head maid what the doctor had said, but the maid replied that they had only been able to call a nurse from the clinic, but her knowledge was not sufficient to help. Carlyle frowned regretfully, thinking that this was his fault, because he could have left the capital's doctor in Pervaz, and then there would have been fewer problems. Nina fell to her knees before Carlisle, still in tears, saying that since they had won the war in the south and Carlisle had been given back his title of Crown Prince, he could bring a court doctor to Pervaz, at least for a short time, so that he could help Asha. It took Carlisle a few seconds to collect his thoughts, and he said thoughtfully that it seemed like the news hadn't reached Pervaz yet. Carlisle informed Nina and the head maid that the Empress had seized the throne, and Matthias had declared himself the new emperor, with his powers extremely limited. Carlisle said that Matthias's main goal now is to take Carlisle's life, which shocked Nina, dashing all her hopes. Carlisle closed his eyes and asked Nina not to make such a face, because in the future he would still become emperor, no matter how hard they tried to stop him. Carlisle asked the headmaid, Della, and Nina to leave Asha's quarters, leaving him alone with her. Della held Nina, trying to give her at least a little confidence that everything would be okay. They left the room, and Carlisle remained next to Asha. Carlisle took her hand anyway, brought it to his lips and kissed it, apologizing for the fact that all of this was his fault and that he was not there all this time. Carlisle said that it was not worth leaving Pervaz. It was not worth interfering in the war in the south, because he knew that Pervaz was short of soldiers. Asha didn't react, and Carlisle continued and said that he should have listened to Asha's concerns about Giles. Carlisle said that he couldn't have been defeated anyway, but it was all his arrogance and stupidity that were to blame. He didn't expect that Asha would become so dear to him, and Carlisle admitted that he was very hurt by the current situation. Only now Carlisle was able to admit that Asha was strong, brave, fair, beautiful, and Carlisle simply could not help but fall in love with her, because she was a wonderful person. Carefully stroking Asha's cheek, Carlisle said that he simply couldn't lose her. He had a lot to ask her forgiveness for, and there were still so many things he wanted to do together. Carlisle leaned over the girl, touching her chin with his fingers, and asked her to wake up. Saying that he was praying to Asha for this, he gently held her head and kissed the girl, hoping that she would really cope with what had happened and wake up. And in the capital, Elon and Dylan, sons of the House of Dupre, were preparing for a trip to pay their respects to the Empress. Cecilia looked at Elon and Dylan with disapproval, thoughtfully saying that they had decided to go to the Empress's banquet after all. Angie asked if Cecilia was worried about what to do, since many aristocrats were confused. Angie also added that Carlisle had returned to Pervaz, which irritated Cecilia, but the girl remained silent. There was no point in commenting on this. What irritated Cecilia even more was that her brothers had spent a lot of money to get an invitation to the Empress's banquet. It seemed as if the sons of the House of Dupre had no pride at all. Cecilia looked into the distance and thought that if Elon became the head of the family, they would end up becoming cash cows for the ruling family, who would squeeze every last drop out of the Dupre family. But Cecilia's thoughts were interrupted. The servant reported that Cecilia had a guest, and when she asked who it was, since she was not expecting anyone, he replied that they had been visited by Vivian, the emperor's former concubine, who urgently needed to see Cecilia. This news surprised Cecilia, but the girl decided to meet Vivian. When she saw her, the first thing she noticed was that Vivian really suited the new clothes in the form of a cloak, which completely hid the girl's identity. With an interested smile, Cecilia asked how Vivian managed to walk around the capital without being caught by the guards. Vivian replied that if the guards wanted to catch her, they would have caught her by now, so she felt like they were deliberately ignoring her. Vivian didn't beat around the bush and immediately told Cecilia that she really wanted Matthias to regret everything he had done, shocking Cecilia with such a statement. Without giving Cecilia a chance to react, Vivian added that she was going to overthrow the Empress and Matthias and make them regret condemning her to such a life. Cecilia let out a loud breath and asked if Vivian had come to her to ask for help with revenge. But Vivian replied that revenge was her business alone, and that she needed Cecilia's help with Carlisle. Vivian said that Cecilia knew that Carlisle had gone to Pervaz, and that help was needed to bring him back to the capital. Cecilia replied with a calm face that, apparently, Vivian greatly overestimated her, and it was not in her power to fulfill Vivian's request. Cecilia said that probably both Giles and Lionel, who were much closer to him than she, tried to convince Carlisle. Besides, the only thing Cecilia had was the title of the youngest daughter of the Dupre house. This could not help them in any way. Cecilia said bitterly that it was obvious that Carlisle had chosen Asha Pervaz, and there was no way she would become empress. Vivian did not agree with the girl's decadent thoughts, and said that it was not at all necessary to become someone's wife in order to gain power, which surprised Cecilia. Vivian stood up, slapped her palm on the table, and tried to passionately convey to Cecilia that there were no laws in the empire that prohibited a woman from being the head of a family. She offered Cecilia to become the head of the Dupré family in exchange for help and protection of Carlisle's interests. Cecilia was confused and said that it was impossible because she had 2 older brothers, but Vivian snapped that everyone in the empire knew that Dylan and Elon were just idiots. Vivian continued to prove that, unlike her, Cecilia could become the head of the family, and that she should not give up her rightful place just because she was a woman. Cecilia said that she would think about these words, but in the girl's soul there was a hope that she could really become the head of her family. Vivian smiled softly and said that she hoped Cecilia would not repeat her mistakes, bowed and hurried away. In Pervaz, a few days later, Carlisle and Lionel were touring the Pervaz castle. Lionel shared with Carlisle that he still could not believe that Carlisle had actually stayed in Pervaz to serve as temporary ruler. Lionel asked if Carlisle really had no plans to return to the capital, and Carlisle confirmed that he had no plans at all for now. Carlisle stopped abruptly, seeing swirls of dark magic and a glowing magic circle in front of him, which were very eye-catching. Carlisle said that he couldn't figure out what the hell this was, and what spells were used on such circles, either summoning or a connecting portal. Carlisle continued to share his thoughts that such circles could have been drawn by the Empress's scouts, but in that case, it was strange that the barbarians tried to break through the border before that. Lionel sat down next to the circle, trying to study it in more detail, and agreed with Carlisle that it was strange. Lionel said thoughtfully that the last attack of the Egram tribe was 15 months ago, which meant that the circles should have appeared in the period after that. Carlisle thought, remembering that 15 months ago they had to go to the capital, and then several ambassadors from the capital and Gabriel arrived in Pervaz, it was quite possible that among them were the Empress's spies, and if you dig a little, you can find the culprit. Shaking his head, Carlisle said that for now it was necessary to focus on the restoration of Pervaz and asked if there were any reports from the capital, to which Lionel replied that he had asked for some medicine to be sent from the capital, and there were responses, but not positive ones. Lionel explained that many of the aristocrats seemed to follow the Empress's orders, and Carlisle replied that it was probably because of his departure to Pervaz. Lionel looked sadly at the cracked walls and said that he was even glad that they had returned, because he had not expected that everything in Pervaz was so bad. Lionel noted that only the castle, which was supposed to be the last bastion, was damaged and almost destroyed, but most of the city remained intact. This happened for the first time. Such cases are not even found in historical records. Carlisle sadly replied that it was because of Asha, because it was she who tried to prevent the monsters from getting out, while Carlisle bitterly thought that he knew that Asha was ready to do anything for Pervaz, but he could not even imagine that it could come to this. Carlisle and Lionel were walking past the window when Lionel suddenly stopped and looked outside, asking Carlisle to take a look as well. There was a carriage outside the window, and Lionel shared with surprise that he couldn't believe that anyone would want to come to Pervaz at such a time. Cecilia finally decided to try to fulfill Vivian's request, so it was she who came to Pervaz. Cecilia was led into the study. Carlisle looked at the girl gloomily. Giles stood behind him. Neither of them was in a hurry to start a conversation. Cecilia, trying to look calm and not show her nervousness, took a small sip of tea, collecting her thoughts. Carlisle finally broke the silence and said that he did not expect Cecilia to decide to visit Pervaz again, since there seemed to be no reason for it. Cecilia admitted that it was quite dangerous here and that it worried her, but she came because she needed to discuss something with Carlisle. Cecilia said that the situation in the capital is not good at all. The Empress is openly strengthening the imperial army. The aristocrats are becoming increasingly worried. Cecilia said that in such circumstances, people's opinion of Carlisle was getting worse since he had gone to Pervaz. But Carlisle only replied with a grin that he had expected it. Carlisle continued that he knew how many aristocrats had gone over to the side of the Dowager Empress, which surprised Cecilia greatly, and she was about to ask a question. But Carlisle interrupted her. Carlisle noted grimly that he had been informed that both sons of the House of Dupré were planning to defect to the Empress, which seemed to knock the wind out of Cecilia. With her hand over her heart, Cecilia hastened to reassure Carlisle that her foolish brothers were acting on their own, but that the House of Dupré would not betray Carlisle. Carlisle, also taking a sip of tea, calmly clarified that this was despite the fact that both heirs of the family attended the banquet organized by the Empress. Cecilia replied grimly that it was for this very reason that she was not going to give Elon and Dylan a chance to lead the Dupré family, because then the family would fall even lower. Carlyle seemed interested in this, and he genuinely wondered what Cecilia was planning to do now in this case. Cecilia directly approached Carlyle with a request to make her the head of the Dupre family when he ascended to the throne, and this would solve a lot of problems. Carlyle chuckled harshly and decided to clarify whether Cecilia understood that such actions automatically meant her betrayal of the Empress. Mirroring Carlyle's expression, Cecilia replied with as much confidence as she could muster that she realized it. Cecilia said that she would stay in Pervaz until the very end and would help Carlyle, and the girl also gave Carlyle an envelope with all the information she had managed to collect throughout the empire. Cecilia remembered Vivian's words about becoming the head of the Dupre family after helping Carlyle. Those words were now vividly floating in her head. These words sowed doubts in Cecilia's soul that she could change many things on her own, and it was these doubts that eventually led her to Pervaz. Cecilia sent her birds all over the empire, collecting bits of information that could somehow help Carlyle. It took time to gather information, but the birds returned to Cecilia with information that pleased her. Cecilia thought that her father had appointed her to be in charge of Dovetail, which meant that there was no reason why she couldn't become the family's heir. Systematization of the information took Cecilia a sleepless night. Sorting through what was written, the girl thought about how much truth, different from what it seems, is hidden under the surface. At that moment, Cecilia only regretted that she had not thought to delve into this investigation earlier. It would have saved a lot of time. One morning, Angie came to Cecilia to greet her mistress, surprised that she had woken up so early, since she usually got up much later. However, seeing the full scale of the work done, Angie was horrified that Cecilia had not even gone to bed yet, and this caused serious worries for the lady. Cecilia confirmed Angie's fears and ordered her to prepare the carriage, as she still had a lot of work to do that could not be postponed. Angie asked Cecilia in surprise where exactly she was going, to which the girl replied with a tired smile that they were heading to Pervaz. Carlyle asked in surprise if Cecilia had really decided to collect all this information that she had given to Carlyle at Vivian's insistence. Cecilia confirmed that Carlyle was right, which made Carlyle laugh a lot. After laughing, Carlyle said that he liked straightforward people like Cecilia, and Vivian still had a lot of work to do in the capital. Carlyle's cheerful mood quickly turned dark when he told Cecily that he knew she had been helping Giles' foment war in the south. For Carlyle to sit on a throne built on the bones of men meant being a tyrant, and he asked if Cecily wanted a tyrant to sit on the throne. Carlyle didn't need Cecilia's answer. He said harshly that if she tried to manipulate him like that again, she would never be able to get his forgiveness. Cecilia bowed her head and apologized to Carlyle. To finally dot the I's and cross the T's, Carlyle said that he could very well make Cecilia the head of the Dupre family, but under no circumstances the Empress. Carlyle asked Cecilia if this was okay with her and whether she would still remain on his side in that case, since he knew that she wanted to be Empress. Cecilia looked up at Carlyle and replied with complete confidence that she was quite content being the head of the Dupre family. Carlyle was surprised by this confidence. He said that it was quite difficult to give up the title of Empress so easily, and it was unusual to hear this. Cecilia explained that she had always wanted to become Empress, but realized that the only thing she could get was imaginary power borrowed from the Emperor, while Cecilia wanted real power that she could use personally without relying on anyone. Cecilia's explanation satisfied Carlyle because it was honest and truthful. He nodded briefly and said that he understood everything. Carlyle smiled softly and told Cecilia that he was glad she had chosen him and would try to trust her again. Bowing her head, Cecilia returned the smile and said that she would try her best to lead Carlyle to victory. For Giles, who was present at this conversation, the greatest shock was that Cecilia Dupre, who had wanted to become Empress all her life, had finally given up on this goal. And in the capital, news reached Gabriel that during the attack on Pervaz, Asha had been injured, and quite seriously. Gabriel couldn't concentrate on his prayer, thinking that he didn't expect the dark magic to prevent Asha from regaining consciousness. Moreover, he learned that if her wounds were not treated as soon as possible, her mind could be severely damaged even if she survived. For that reason, Gabriel decided that the best thing for him to do now would be to go to Pervaz himself to help Asha. Carlyle spent every free minute in Pervaz in Asha's room, not wanting to leave her alone. He was extremely worried about her. Asha's wounded body still looked terrible, bandaged, cut, and bruised, but that wasn't the worst of her condition. Asha could not escape from the trap of the day they were attacked. She did not regain consciousness and remained lying motionless. She heard Decker's voice telling her that the monsters had started to act strangely, since they had never reacted so aggressively before. Asha looked at her next opponents, surrounded by dark energy and a furious aura, realizing that Decker was completely right, but they didn't have a choice. Asha was trying to figure out what exactly had changed in the monster's behavior so as not to fall into a trap when she was called out. Pervaz's joyful soldiers shouted that they had found holy water and discovered that if they poured it on the magic circle, it would stop working. Asha thought that if this was true, they would just need to defeat all the remaining enemies, and everything would be over. This inspired everyone very much. With renewed strength, Asha's squad rushed into battle, believing that the end of this horror was already very close, and they would no longer have to see their comrades die. There was only one barbarian left, who was already sitting powerlessly on his knee, as if awaiting his end. It was clear that he would not be able to resist. Asha raised her sword over him, preparing to deliver the final blow, saying goodbye with a hint of regret to the barbarian who was their enemy. But during the blow, the regret passed, and Asha already called the barbarian a demonic bastard, remembering everything they had done in the castle. When the blow had already touched the barbarian, he said something incomprehensible, and a clot of dark energy burst from the hand of the fallen barbarian. This clot passed through Asha, clearly not giving her any pleasant sensations, but on the contrary, bringing something that no one should feel. A few seconds later, Asha's face twisted into a grimace of pain, and Asha exhaled very sharply. Asha couldn't stay on her feet and eventually fell to the floor. Decker ran up to the girl, but he couldn't do anything anymore. She was under the power of dark magic. Lying on the floor, Asha wondered internally if she would really die like this when victory seemed so close. Asha was very sorry and thought that she simply could not leave Decker alone. He would definitely cope, but it would be too cruel to him. Through her heavy sleep, Asha heard someone's voices sometimes breaking through into her thoughts. But she didn't know that it was Carlyle who was really sitting next to her bed, holding the girl's hand and simply afraid to let her go. Carlyle's voice seemed to Asha to be just a part of her dream, which could not help her escape from her endless nightmare caused by dark magic. Meanwhile, in Pervaz, the one whom Giles ran and enthusiastically went to meet arrived. It was his own daughter, for whom he had plans. Opening the carriage door, Giles greeted Dorothea, whom he himself had urgently summoned to Pervaz. The girl looked very tired. Dorothea took a careless step and twisted her ankle and fell down the carriage steps in front of Giles, without being seriously hurt, but the situation was unfortunate. Giles's good humor was instantly dampened by Dorothea's clumsiness, and he reproached his daughter for being 23 years old and still unable to learn manners, to which Dorothea attempted to justify herself by saying that the carriage was shaking so much that she felt a little seasick. Turning away from Dorothea, Giles stated that Cecilia had arrived in Pervaz in exactly the same carriage, but somehow nothing had happened to her, and she was in perfect health. Dorothea did not reply to Giles's unjust accusations, as it would lead to nothing, and hurried after him. But it was difficult for Dorothea to keep up with Giles, for she found that she had a sore foot, and every step was painful, but she did not dare tell her father about it. Giles and Dorothea came into the office, where Giles immediately stunned Dorothea with the news that Cecilia had refused to fight for the place of Empress. To Dorothea's surprise, Giles smirked and said that Cecilia had in fact been rejected because she had fallen under Carlyle's wrath for her involvement with Giles in organizing the war with the South. It was the first time Dorothea had heard that her father and Cecilia had been involved in the Southern affair, but Giles calmly continued that he had also served a suspended sentence for some time, but that was no big deal, because Carlyle would not be able to refuse his mentor. Dorothea asked whether Giles had specifically teamed up with Cecilia, to which she received a positive answer, since it was a strategically advantageous alliance. Giles explained that he had anticipated Carlyle's reaction this way, and so had decided that it would be to his advantage to ally with Cecilia anyway. Giles added that Carlyle had categorically disapproved of the plan to organize a war with the South from the very beginning, and would never have agreed to it himself. And it was for this reason that Giles was confident that if he brought Cecilia Dupre into this matter, he would eventually be able to take her out of the game. Giles came closer to Dorothea and said excitedly that he had called her to come all this way so that she could play her part and take her rightful place. Giles mercilessly said that Asha Pervaz was dying, which meant that this was Dorothea's chance to make a good impression on Carlyle. Dorothea was horrified by the news and asked how Asha could have ended up dying. but Giles had no plans to share these details with his daughter. All Giles told Dorothea was that Asha had stood firm in defending Pervaz and that her life was in danger because of it. Dorothea worriedly asked what was wrong with the rest of the inhabitants of Pervaz, to which Giles waved her off, saying that everyone was in a similar state, frightening his daughter even more. Giles put a patronizing hand on Dorothea's shoulder and told her that she shouldn't get too attached to the people of Pervaz. Without commenting further, Giles left the office, leaving Dorothea with mixed feelings about everything that had happened. Dorothea remembered how kind Asha had been to her, always ready to help, showing her Pervaz's library despite her embarrassment. Dorothea also remembered Decker, who was also kind to her, discussed a book she liked with her, and promised to fix her watch. They were all good people. Dorothea froze in horror, realizing that these moments might never happen again, and that people she truly liked might die. Dorothea's stomach twisted with pain, and a scream almost escaped her lips as she realized that Giles, her father, was asking her to take advantage of the deaths of others. Dorothea sank helplessly to the floor, covering her mouth with her hands to keep from screaming and yelling, because this realization was truly a nightmare. This time, not only Carlyle was at Asha's bedside, but also Decker, who was also very worried about the girl, but understood his complete helplessness. Suddenly, Decker noticed that there was a slight glow around Asha's hand that Carlyle was holding, which shocked Decker. Decker exclaimed if Carlyle could use divine power. Carlyle replied that he could only use that power a little bit, as he was blessed by the gods. Decker thought it was just a metaphor, but now he realized that it was not. Carlyle explained that such intervention was only a temporary measure, and they needed to bring a priest-healer to Asha as soon as possible, but the church had already completely gone over to the Empress's side. Carlyle grinned and noted that if Ash got worse, he was even ready to steal the priest, to which Decker retorted that the church would not sit idly by in that case. Carlyle said with confidence that no matter what it cost him, he would do anything to save Asha, because she was dear to him. Carlyle and Decker's conversation was interrupted by the sound of the door opening, causing both men to tense up as not many people had entered the room. It turned out that it was Dorothea who came in, who immediately apologized for the interrupted conversation and explained that she only wanted to express her respect to Carlyle. Dorothea's appearance instantly enraged Carlyle, who said quietly but very angrily that he had conveyed to Dorothea through his attendant that there was no need for any personal expression of respect, and that her presence there suggested that Giles had sent the girl to see if Asha was dead. Dorothea was frightened and tried to justify herself, but she could not find the right words. Only something unintelligible came out that could not calm Carlyle. Before the situation became critical, Decker decided to intervene in the conversation, standing between Carlyle and Dorothea and saying that Carlyle was doing the wrong thing. Laughing and diffusing the situation with this sincere laughter, Decker noted that it was awkward and embarrassing to greet without being present in person, so it was logical that Dorothea decided to come. Carlyle did feel a twinge of guilt, so he apologized to Dorothea for his overreaction to her arrival here. Dorothea bowed and replied that nothing terrible had happened and apologized again for disturbing Carlyle and Decker. Noticing Dorothea's depressed state, Decker said that he would go and see the girl off so that she would feel a little better and there would be no more misunderstandings. Leaving Asha's room with Dorothea, Decker worriedly asked if the girl was okay. Dorothea wanted to answer that she did, but suddenly she felt something wet on her cheeks, realizing that she had burst into tears and embarrassed that the tears had flowed in front of strangers. Dorothea tried to wipe away her tears and turn away from Decker, apologizing to him for such a display of emotion, but Decker assured her that it was nothing to worry about, and in fact, he also cried when Carlyle suddenly became angry. Having calmed down more or less, Dorothea looked at Decker and asked if Asha was okay, and if she would get better. Dorothea was genuinely worried about her. Decker smiled, but not so carelessly. He replied that Asha would definitely be okay, because Carlyle made a promise, and he would do everything possible for her. Dorothea accepted this answer. The girl said that Asha was a very strong woman and would definitely cope, and asked to tell her if she suddenly needed her help. Decker thanked Dorothea for her words and offer of help, and turned away, leaving the girl alone and with her thoughts. Dorothea's help was needed just a few days later. She came to visit Asha and decided to examine the girl, concluding that powerful demonic energy had entered Asha. Carlyle noted that he did not know that Dorothea had such knowledge, to which the girl replied that she had read about similar symptoms in a book, of which she had read a great many. Carlyle said thoughtfully that if Asha had been exposed to demonic energy, she urgently needed the help of a priest healer, but neither of them would go to Purvaz now. Dorothea drew Carlyle's attention to herself, who was lost in thought, by saying that she was not sure she should say what she was about to say. Dorothea explained that against such a level of demonic energy, mere priests would be insufficient, and that someone of the level of High Priest Gabriel would be needed to heal Asha. Carlyle clenched his fists, feeling angry again, and explained that Gabriel was in cahoots with those who did all this to Asha and Purvaz, and he was unlikely to help. Carlyle sighed, calming down, and said that Dorothea might not know this, but Gabriel was a supporter of the Empress, so he couldn't be allowed into Purvaz. This was indeed unexpected news for Dorothea, who tried to believe the best in people, and it seemed to her that Gabriel was a good man. Carlyle said wearily that they needed to think of a way to secretly bring the priest to Purvaz, and Dorothea went into thought. Unexpectedly for Carlyle, Dorothea asked him if they could ask a favor even from an enemy in order to save Asha, since the situation was critical. Carlyle didn't like this question. He looked at Dorothea with a heavy gaze and asked what she meant. Standing at attention and trying not to tremble, Dorothea said as confidently as she could that the only way to save Asha was with the power of the High Priest. The more time passed, the worse Asha became, so they had to try to bring Gabriel to Purvaz as quickly as possible, even if it was risky. Carlyle thought about it. He remembered that Gabriel was quite friendly with Asha, so perhaps he would still answer if he reported the girl's condition to the church. Carlyle told Dorothea about his decision to pass the news about Asha to the church, which surprised her greatly, because the girl was sure that she could not convince Carlyle, although she believed that this was the only possible way out. Carlyle smiled softly, realizing that it was in his assessment of Dorothea that he had been mistaken, projecting onto her an image of Giles that was in fact not at all applicable to the girl. Carlyle said he was confident in this decision because Dorothea seemed to be one of the few who genuinely cared about Purvaz and Asha. The conversation with Dorothea was over, but before Carlyle could say goodbye, a cry was heard that someone had something urgent for him. Dorothea's farewell was awkward but friendly, with the girl curtsying and Carlyle gesturing that the girl didn't have to. Carlyle walked out of Asha's room, meeting a worried Lionel, and asked what was so urgent that he was in such a state. It seemed that Lionel himself did not believe what he was saying, because the news was amazing, but he said that the High Priest Gabriel had arrived in Purvaz. This coincidence shocked Carlyle, and he was not sure whether to be happy about such news, but in any case, Gabriel's appearance was very timely.